A few weeks back, I installed a CB radio into my 2018 Jeep Wrangler JK Unlimited Rubicon. I was researching CB radios for quite some time after I acquired the Jeep, but then a trail run was scheduled, or that was being organized by the San Diego Jeep Club, that I wanted to attend. And there was about 2 weeks, I guess, when I found out about it, and they do require CB radios. And I could have probably borrowed one from someone there, like a handheld, but since I knew I wanted a CB radio, I decided to go ahead and get it at that point in time. And so the only CB radio that I sort of had at the top of my list was the Cobra 75 WXST, which is the one I purchased. I was sort of looking into the United, I think it's United in their Bearcat model, but then I didn't want a full-on unit. I was pondering the full-on unit. It looks really cool. It's not much more expensive than the Cobra 75, which is more of a all-in-one into the handheld with a small control box that you can hide away. But having that sort of larger unit, having to mount that, I wasn't really keen on that, considering the Jeep Wrangler doesn't really have much space in the interior anyway. You can mount it above the mirror, but I wanted to save that for the possibility of the S-Pod. So I sort of wanted to have a nice, cleaner, slimline form factor to have as far as the CB radio. So that's why I went with the Cobra 75. As far as the antenna, I went ahead and bought the official, if you want to say the official Mopar JK antenna kit. I know a lot of people think you can just piece it together for cheaper, which you can, but after looking at, I think at the time it was just easier to get the JK antenna kit because it was going to arrive faster, so I went ahead and went with that route. The one thing about the Fire Stick antenna, which is one of the more popular ones for CB antennas, is that you can adjust it a lot more easily as far as the SWR metering, which I'll talk about in a few. And the one that you have here, the Mopar antenna, requires that you actually cut the antenna as opposed to using some sort of a threaded adjustment on the Fire Stick. Granted, this one comes tuned from Mopar for the JK, which you can put as much faith in that as you want. But anyway, I decided we'll go with this kit. It was a lot faster to get that, along with the Cobra 75, and I installed it in a day or two, just after I figured out what I needed to do as far as the install. But let's just go ahead and give you a little close-up rundown of the setup I have. The most common way to install the antenna onto the back of a Jeep Wrangler is on the stock spare tire mount, and most of them are all the same. It's just a bracket that you install in between two of the, you basically take out two of the bolts holding the spare carrier and you just sandwich that bracket in between those two existing bolts. And then from there you have the coaxial cable, or the antenna, that sticks on the bracket, and the coaxial cable comes down. Fairly simple. You just gotta take the tire carrier off and then install the bracket with your antenna. Here's a close-up of the Mopar JK antenna bracket sandwiched in between the spare tire and the spare tire carrier. You see those are the existing bolts in there that you're just basically reusing. The bracket is unpainted. Some of the third-party ones are finished. From what I understand, you need to ground the antenna, which I did not ground it. Some people say you need to run a grounding wire from the antenna bracket to somewhere on the tailgate that's unfinished. I'm guessing that the way they get around this with the Mopar kit is that the unfinished bracket, along with the existing stainless steel bolts going into the tailgate, allows for that grounding. Right now, I haven't had any problems with any sort of performance. Granted, maybe it'll get better. Maybe I just don't understand how that all works and how to make comparative assessments versus grounded and an ungrounded antenna. But leave it as it may, I had no issues using my CB radio during the trail run, and just casual usage on the freeway. I receive and send very easily. Anyway, as you can see here from the antenna, it does extend above the roofline by at least 12 inches, maybe as long as 14. I didn't measure it, but you want to keep this into account when you decide to install an antenna. And if you have a low clearance garage, or your garage door comes down, or if you have a lift, just keep this in mind that your antenna will probably hit. But you do need a long antenna. You need an antenna that goes over the roofline in order to get decent reception or performance out of your antenna or your CB radio. So the most important aspect of a CB radio install is the wiring and the cabling. You have three aspects of cabling: the coaxial cable, the actual power, and then the CB radio handheld unit itself. So as far as the coaxial cable is concerned, I'm running it down from the bracket, obviously, into the tailgate, which you cannot really see here. I'm going to try to focus as best I can. You can see it running down. I can't take off the spare tire carrier where I'm at right now, or the spare tire rather. But as you can see here, it's running underneath the mount into the tailgate. And so it's running into that vent on the tailgate. There's that vent behind the spare tire carrier on the tailgate, and it's just open. It's just got rubber flaps, and I'll have photos on a blog article that I'm going to post as well in conjunction with this video that will show you how I wired it up, or how I ran the cable. There's a small hole, or sorry, not a hole, but more of a rubber grommet, which you can see here if I can get it to focus. That is sealed, this rubber grommet right here, and they tell you to cut a hole through that to run the cable through it. I didn't understand that when you already had open vents in the tailgate that you could run a cable into and then up into the outside or into the inside of the tailgate. So I went that route instead. I didn't want to cut that grommet open. But we'll go ahead and open the tailgate and I'll show you where the cable runs out of. During the install, you have to take off this cover that on the back of the tailgate or the inside of the tailgate that conceals the cabling and the wiring. And if you don't have a plastic type of pry tool, you should get one, because it's very handy in order to open up all the various panels on your Jeep interior in order to run cabling. But I'm going to go ahead and just open this up carefully as best I can. It's basically just retention clips holding this cable cover on the tailgate. So as you can see here, I'm actually running the coaxial cable out from it runs outside into the vents and back up inside here out this hole that you have. This is the same hole you would use to come back out if you were going to cut that grommet open on the outside of the tailgate. And you're just going to run it straight up through here and along these cabling, the existing wires for your tail lights, the third brake light, and the tail lights. And then just runs it straight through here inside to the interior of the Jeep. Here's a close-up of the interior of the tailgate with the coaxial coming out of the tailgate to the interior side of the tailgate, running along the wiring, existing wiring, and I went ahead and zip tied it right here, runs along here, and then to hold it together with the rest of this cabling here that exists for the third brake light and whatnot, I used two-sided or double-sided Velcro, and then another zip tie at this location here to hold it all together. Probably better if I zip tied it a little again here just to keep things nice, but I think it's holding it up fairly cleanly here. Now, running to the inside of the Jeep itself, this is where it starts to get a little trickier. So you do need to, I recommend you need to just pry out this panel, and I'm not going to do that on this video. You're going to, in order to, I would say you're going to need to pry this piece off here, which is around the roll bar. This is a two-piece, so you just take this part off. It's pretty easy to pry off, and then pry out this piece, this whole piece here. Then you can run the cabling inside here, and then you just sort of lift this carpet back, the interior of the carpet back, and that you can run the cable all along the inside through all the way to the side here. And I'll have photos sort of how I ran mine and a diagram on that same blog article on this CB radio install right up. But it's just going to run out towards the passenger rear door, and we'll go ahead and come around and I'll show you where it runs through. So here's a view from the passenger rear door. There's the backside, and the cabling is going to run across underneath this deal here along the side, and it's going to come down, and I have it coming down underneath this trim, underneath the carpet here, which you can still lift up. It's pretty easy to lift this up. And if you can see with the lighting, it's going to be kind of weird here because I got direct sunlight behind me and I'm going to be shadowing it. But I'm running the cabling underneath all this and then underneath here, and you can lift this up. It's just exposed, and you can see inside underneath the carpeting to this plastic trim here. Now, I don't have a tool to remove that plastic trim This stuff is held in. I mean, I could use I have a metal tool actually. I didn't want to use that just because I'm gonna just jack all this up, trying to lift it out. So I just, I sort of cheated and just shoved it underneath the carpeting here, and I was able to lift this carpet up right here and just sort of get the cabling underneath that carpet and just sort of wedge it in there. So it is running underneath the trim without actually having to remove the trim. From there, the coaxial cable runs all the way to the front, passenger front. So we're gonna go ahead and jump to the passenger front and I'll show you where the cabling is there. Now we're on the inside of the passenger front, looking at the side of the passenger front trim. So earlier I said I ran from the rear passenger side underneath the carpet and trim to the front. So sorry for the lighting conditions here, but I got the sun behind me. So I'm running the coaxial cable underneath this trim here up until this point. So considering I was having difficulties taking out the trim without jacking up the screws, I didn't want to mess up the screws, or whatever these retention screws are here with a metal pry tool. That wasn't designed for these things. I had a decision. So do I run up until this point here through the trim, up until the top of the trim to run it into the dash, or do I find an alternate route? And I decided to go the alternate route, and that's underneath the front passenger seat. So if you lift up this carpet here, you can see where I stopped at the coaxial cable here, and it ran it right across, and it runs underneath the passenger seat. It's all concealed by carpeting, and you can see, I think you can see the coaxial cable run up, and run up the coaxial cable to the front side, or sorry, the passenger center console, and it runs underneath this. If you can barely see it here, I run underneath this trim here, and it's all concealed at this point, and it runs it all the way up until the center dash, up and behind the glove box. I made that decision. You can probably run it underneath here, probably get a little bit more creative than I did, but I decided to make that choice as far as the cabling is concerned. But let's go ahead and rip out the glove box and I'll show you what it looks like behind there. Now we're looking at the interior of the dash with the glove box removed. You can see here the little box for the actual CB radio. This is the main sort of unit of the, I say the guts of the CB radio, which is separated from the handheld. This is what's plugged directly into the coaxial cable for your antenna and what's plugged in for your power. As you can see here, the red and black. But I have that just zip tied. It's a small box and it fits right underneath this little bracket here that is for the glove box of the glove compartment, and as well as your cabin air filter. I use zip ties. This is probably the most common method seen today for the Cobra 75 WX ST CB radio into Jeep Wranglers. Some people will still mount it underneath the seat, but that requires some drilling. Well, yeah, it does require drilling through the floor. Obviously, I didn't want to do that, so I decided to go with the zip tie route. Just a little caveat though, be careful with these brackets here. They're very sharp edged. They're not very, they didn't clean them up with a file or anything, and so they're kind of jaggedy. So just keep that in mind when you're installing something in there. You'll probably cut yourself if you're not careful. But as you can see here, this is where everything hooks up to, so I have the coaxial cable right there. That's for the antenna. Now let's take a look at the power really quick, and I'll just go ahead and rip off the side of the dash for you. We're now looking at the side of the dash with the panel removed. Just an FYI, you can remove this panel very easily with just a simple pry tool. You don't have to remove any other trim, which I ended up doing because I was being a moron and didn't even bother trying to remove the side panel without testing. I just removed the A-pillar, and I removed the top A-pillar panels before even trying to remove the side panel, but you can remove the side panel without moving anything else. But in order to do your wiring for your power, you have to poke a hole through the firewall here, which I did. You can see this is just straight up foam. You're going to poke a hole through the firewall so you can run the power cable from the CB radio box along with the negative ground through there. Just poke a hole through it, and if it'll help you, maybe run a stick or some sort of string or zip tie or something just to poke it through, and you can string it out through the hood, and we'll go ahead and show you that later. As you can see here, this is my cabling for the dash cam, which I also ran a long time ago, a couple months back when I first installed that, so that runs underneath the dash as well. And there's no way for me to record video on it because it's going to be too dark when I try to record, but underneath the dash, There is a lot of wiring here. This is some of this existing. This is existing. But if you can barely see underneath there, you might see the hint of that drab, that coyote tan type strip there. That's Velcro, the two-sided Velcro, the same one I used for the securing the coaxial cable to the existing wiring on the tailgate. But I'm running a bunch of that to secure these cables to this bar. There's a metal crossbeam behind here. So that's a nice place that you can zip tie or strap cables so they're not hanging on the passenger side's feet area, so you don't have anyone accidentally kicking or somehow, you know, snagging on cables. And I might want to go ahead and do this one too, this power cable, just clean this up a little bit, but I don't know, it doesn't extend farther down than the existing cable, so I'm not going to worry about it too much right now. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump to the hood. Continuing the second part of the cabling is the actual power and ground cables from the CB radio box. I mentioned earlier in that previous segment that we poked a hole through the passenger side front firewall through that from that side panel when it's removed, and it comes out through here, and you're probably not going to see it on video because it's going to be too dim. I don't think I can adjust exposure enough to get that, but essentially it runs straight out from the hole in the firewall to what's underneath the cowling here for the underneath the hood. So here's the cowling here, runs straight through, and it'll just run along the side of the hood. Now, as far as the wiring to the battery for power, I ran straight to the battery because everyone recommends you go for a CB radio straight to the battery for the cleanest power to avoid any sort of static. So that's what I did. I'm running straight to one of the terminals, accessory terminals, and I'm running the negative lead to, or the ground lead to the negative side of the battery, which some people say you should do, or some people say you shouldn't do, but I did that anyway. What I did do though for both ends is use a 5 amp fuse, inline fuse. This is just one of your, I think they're called mini fuses, or mini, I don't know the terminology, but it's a mini fuse, but it's basically a 5 amp on the inside there. It's just a rubber compartment holding that 5 amp fuse. And so I did it for both the positive and the negative cables, or the positive and the ground cables. So I'm running them straight to the battery. Pretty simple, and I just use crimp connectors, or what do you call them? I'm really bad at cabling, even though I took computer science. But anyway, these are crimp connectors. They're supposed to be weatherproof, but I did those. I think the one mistake I did do during this install was not putting some heat shrink tubing. I should have ran heat shrink tubing, so I may unplug all this later, clip the fuses, the inline fuses right there off, and then put heat shrink tubing and then re-crimp them again. As you can see, I cheaped out and put gaff tape to hold this together, or to hold it flush. Gaffer's tape, for those who don't know, it's used in the media production industry to hold stuff, and the adhesive shouldn't damage the paint. It will leave it. It's not supposed to leave residue, but I've found that over time it will leave residues, but it's easy to come off. So I ran just gaff tape here on the inside of the hood, inside of the cowling, up against the engine compartment, just to keep it from flopping around. But again, I highly recommend, if you do this, to get some heat shrink tubing to run it on the cables here. So I'm probably going to fix this or alleviate this in the very near future. The last bit of cabling for the CB radio install is going to be the handheld unit, which is also plugged into the box here. There's actually a cord that comes out that's already hooked up to the box that connects to the handheld, and it's all underneath here. It's all tucked in behind here and velcroed, secured. In that handheld unit, as you can see the cabling here, it just runs underneath this trim here, and it's just tucked there, so it's not visible, and it just runs up behind. It's sandwiched between the center console and the center dash, and I just run the cable obviously through here and hooked up to the dash. The dash, I do have this connector here. This is a Jeep Unique. That is Jeep, U-N-I-Q. They sell a bunch of accessory mounts for Jeeps that will hold CB radios and even ham radio handhelds. Take a look at them. This one is it's basically it's a non-permanent, so you can simply reverse it. All you do is take off this passenger grab bar. This is just remove this trim. I think 8mm bolts to remove this. Take this off. Put the Jeep Unique mount in between here. Just kind of you kind of squeeze this around the edges of the grab bar, and you can kind of see here it's supposed to form fit. It does take a little bit of maneuvering to get it around it, but you should be able to get it into place fairly easily. Once you get that in, just secure the grab bar with the socket for the 8mm screws, and that's it. And then it's just nice, just holds it right there. And then I'll go ahead and crank up the radio. You can hear I just have it tuned on the weather stations just so you can hear the reception. But other than that, it works pretty well. That essentially sums up how I installed the Cobra 75 WXST and the Mopar Jeep JK antenna kit into my 2018 JK Unlimited Rubicon. You can take some liberties away from what I did as far as your cabling is concerned, but from what I did, you may follow it and come away happy. You may decide to go through that grommet, which I didn't do, instead of coming through the vents. It's up to you. Where you cable it, you may defer from mine, especially when it comes to the point of where to the dash you want to come out. Do you want to come out through all the way through the side, or do you want to cut across the passenger, underneath the passenger seat to come up to the dash? It's all up to you. This coaxial cable that the kit comes with, I believe, is 18 feet, and I still have enough slack, so I probably could have taken a different route, especially if you want to go up to the top end. If you're going to install an actual box, a full-on unit, you can install above your mirror. You might want to take that into account, maybe even take an 18-foot string or rope and just make sure that you can get all the way there, depending, to make sure that you don't run the entire coaxial cable and decide, oh, I can't make it. So just test it out just beforehand, but I figured the way I routed it, I was pretty confident that I would have enough slack. The SWR, which I didn't refer to like I said I would. Anyway, there's a SWR, I can't even remember because I'm not really deep into radio tech, but SWR, the metering, you want it to run between 1 and 2. 1 and 1.5 is ideal, but 1 and 2 is basically usable. And you're supposed to hook up this meter, and then you're supposed to run it and do their tests, and you run it on channel 1, channel 40, and then depending on how much the difference is, it could vary between 1 and 2, or even higher. If that level, your SWR measurement comes above 2, you need to make adjustments to your antenna, either trimming or adding on, which is probably the more difficult part. But usually these things are set up so that you have to trim, because trimming is easier to do. I didn't run the SWR meter. You're supposed to go out into a nice open field with no obstacles and run your metering tests there, but I just went ahead and shoved it on there, went on my trail run. I tested it a little bit, after I installed. I went around and tried to get receive. I didn't have another spare receiver radio to test against, but I took it on faith that this was going to work. And so far, I'm having no problems. So I do have the SWR box, the metering box, and they're very inexpensive. They're only about 20 bucks from Amazon. Maybe I'll do the test sometime, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave it at that and run it as is. But anyway, this is my setup. Again, I'm gonna have a blog article written up to accompany this video that I'll have on okabj.net with some photos. And I'll have a diagram too of how I cabled the coaxial cable and how I cabled the power. Just a little diagram so that it's easy to refer to, as far as if you weren't able to follow this video and you're not able to follow the photos on the article. But anyway, that's it for my Cobra 75 WXST and Mopar JK Jeep antenna kit install. Thanks for watching.
Radio check, 1, 2. Lima Charlie. Radio check. Sounds good.